Cutthroat competition or active cooperation? That's a question left hanging after the first meeting between Chinese and U.S. senior officials last week. For years, the U.S. has launched the trade wars and human rights accusations against China. China on Thursday slammed some foreign companies, including H&M, for banning cotton from northwest China's Xinjiang Uygur Autonomous Region, citing the so-called use of forced labor. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said the forced labor in Xinjiang is a complete lie and a smear campaign concocted by some anti-China organizations. After last week's fiery exchange in Anchorage, Alaska, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken met his NATO counterparts in Brussels on Tuesday, telling them the transatlantic security alliance should be, quote, focused on some of the challenges that China poses to the rule-based international order, end of quote. Can China-U.S. ties under Biden administration able to weather mistrust, or this is likely to go even worse? I talked to Stephen Roach, senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute of Global Affairs and a senior lecturer at Yale School of Management. Let's listen in. Of course, the issue of cotton on the global supply chain is being discussed. As we see, the latest trade issue is concerning the cotton from Xinjiang. Now, it is great quality. As everybody knows, China is among the top 3 cotton producers in the world. The others are India and the United States. Now, with the so-called human rights issue, there has been companies, particularly international companies, many of them American and the Europeans, have to show their attitude toward the use of this cotton. Now, we all understand everybody's going to be hurt as a result. You know, the interests of these companies, global companies, the workers that are working in them, the market that they're having. The issue is who is going to be the winner. Mr. Roach, I've been looking at this issue and really wonder, are all the economic and trade issues now going to be hijacked by politics or politics-related issues?
You know, we have tended to focus a lot on economics and trade, and if there's one thing the Biden administration has done, and they underscored this at the meeting in Anchorage, was to change the priorities and really focus much more on these human rights allegations from Xinjiang to Hong Kong, and also express concerns over China's geopolitical issues in the South China Sea. So the message here is that the Biden administration is seemingly willing to shift the priorities, but there will be consequences for that, probably on the economic and trade issues, if that turns out to be the case.
I really wonder about whether this will be a single case or it is likely to set a precedence, whether it's between China and other trade partners or among other trading partners themselves, that politics will play a big role, that even a big word as hegemony will have a huge impact on how business is going to be conducted in the future, despite of the rules of business and the logic of business, Professor?
That's a great question. When politicians or global statesmen or leaders decide to express their concerns over what they call human rights or geopolitical issues by taking economic actions, then there will be consequences for those actions. And if they're willing to tolerate those consequences, which in the case of cotton means moving away from high quality, low cost Chinese cotton to other sources of cotton, which would be the functional equivalent of a tax increase on the consumers of cotton in the United States and elsewhere around the world. They, by shifting the focus, they are imposing a tax on their consumers. And so, it does change the sense of priority in addressing economic issues vis-a-vis human rights. For a long time, we have placed the highest priority on economic issues, and if there's now a reprioritization going along, there will be economic consequences for that rethinking.
Earlier, we already had some lesson, isn't it? I mean, this administration coming into power claiming that the earlier administration using sanctions against China did not work. But now they're in the office and they're using, once again, politics into the issues of business and also economy. This, to me, doesn't make sense if you compare notes, earlier statements and what's going on right now.
Well, look, any economist, especially someone like me, I've been writing about this for years. The history of tariffs and sanctions has nothing but tragic precedents. Go back to the 1930s, you can see for yourself what a global trade war led to in terms of the Great Depression. We know that. We know that you should not be looking at trade through bilateral deficits. Any economist will tell you that it's a multilateral problem.
Yeah.
But the politicians, if they're inclined to reprioritize their focus, then they will have to face the consequences of how this will backfire through the trade relationships that are very important in supporting their respective economies.
One of the things is also about what's going to happen to the global supply chains and global manufacturing chains. Professor Cotton is only one of those examples, but it's one of the very important examples because it brings almost all different kinds of levels of economies together, developing country, emerging economies, developed economies. Their markets are very different, but together. So how do you see this interesting and sad example is likely to show us how the global supply chain is going to work? Is it going to be global supply chain for the United States and allies and global supply chains for China and other countries? To me, that is just ridiculous, but is it what's happening?
And while I understand your concern about cotton, because it is emblematic of this tension between non-economic and economic issues.
Right.
The real issue for supply chains involves sophisticated manufactured products like Apple iPhones, for example, that are assembled in China but reflect components from all over the world. And so if we begin to take apart these more complex supply chains that have taken, by the way, years, if not decades, to assemble, there could be major consequences in a wide range of products, from consumer electronics to automobiles and parts, to aircraft, to appliances. So I think we have to be very careful. I'm suspicious of this movement, what I've written about, called supply chain liberation, that we can just automatically bring the supply chains back to our home markets. The research shows that supply chains are pretty sticky. They take a lot of effort to develop and improve the quality of the assembly and the final product. So it's not that you can just push a button and change your sourcing from one country to another or back so easily to your home markets.
Meanwhile, as a result of this, the overall global trade system and also the ways of doing business will likely to change if that is the precedence we're seeing, for example, with this issue of cotton. So, Professor, what would that mean for global governance also?
Well, we have set up under the leadership of the United States, which it certainly it moved away from dramatically over the past 4 years. The World Trade Organization is a rules-based framework to govern the cross-border commerce around the world. and to adjudicate disputes if and when they arise with an objective panel. The Trump administration, of course, blocked the appointment of officials who were charged with adjudication, and there is a clear need for some reforms to be considered in terms of WTO governance. But it is the system that we have. It's a system that the United States and other nations, including China, have committed to, and it's the best system we have. And I think we need to renew our commitment to that as soon as possible.
The other thing is, what about international business? Global companies, they are operating, their lifeline is global supply chain and also a global operation. Now, if the cotton thing is a precedent, there's not only the issue of global supply chain being spoiled, but also how global companies will have to face politics on every issue, probably, from now on. So what would that mean for the fate of global companies, which is contributing tremendously, shall we say, to the global economy? Of course, they have their problems, but they're a great contributor of employment, of economic growth in various parts of the world.
Look, global multinational corporations certainly are now very much reliant on the efficiency solutions that are offered by global supply chains. The multinational corporation came into being because cost structures in home markets were prohibitively expensive in countries like the United States or Germany or even Japan. And so there was a growing recognition that we had the logistics, the technology, and the access to cheaper labor that was increasingly better educated to draw on the comparative advantage of these offshore platforms to drive new efficiencies and new profitability and jobs into multinational corporations around the world. So if you want to take that apart and end the efficiency solution of supply chains, it's a tax on multinational corporations and the workers they employ, and the communities that those workers support. And that would be a major setback to globalization as we know it, which has been an important force in driving global prosperity.
Professor, you talked a lot about reasoning, logic, data, number, facts. But my question to you is, do they really matter anymore these days when politics seems to be the posturing also, seems to be the deciding factor for everything?
Well, that's a tough question. I write a lot, I speak a lot, I teach, teaching at Yale for now my 11th year, and my approach has always been data-based, analytical, and hopefully grounded in a deep appreciation of economic theory. But increasingly in my courses, I focus a lot on what we refer to as the political economy, the balancing act between politics and economics, and recognize that a lot of our economic analysis gets compromised by political decisions. Take for example the policy of the central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve. We like to think that our Federal Reserve is politically independent, which means that they are not have to deal with the pressures imposed by the Congress or the president. And yet, the Fed has become an important part of the political process that generates large budget deficits and addresses crisis after crisis with extraordinary unconventional monetary policies. And so, politics plays an increasingly important role in driving public policy, public economic policy, international policy, and then, outcomes that affect domestic and the global economy. So your point is well taken.
At the just concluded press conference, the very first one Biden gave since he came into the office, he talked about China-U.S. relations did not necessarily in a rivalry light, and yet the word competition being mentioned a lot. He also shaped it with kind of ideology about so-called the democracy versus autocracy, whether you believe it or not. How do you see this approach by the current administration, at least during the first presser he has?
Well, I listened to those words pretty carefully, and his focus is more, at least in those remarks, were much more on the ideological conflict between two different systems than they were on trade and economic issues, which has been the area that most of us have focused on for a long, long time. And that's too bad, because I think, on the trade and economic issue, there are real opportunities to do it differently, to move away from this phase one framework that Trump negotiated, and move into a much more constructive engagement on some of these tough structural issues. And Biden, at this point, has shown really no inclination to abandon the approach that he was handed by President Trump, which is, I think, a mistake.
Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow at the Yale University's Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, Senior Lecturer at Yale School of Management. What a pleasure, sir. My conversation with Stephen Roach on the latest issue of cotton in global supply chain and also China-U.S. trade and economic ties.